So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share some reflections. Those who've printed out the agenda, it's actually, you'll notice I've changed the title, but that'll become clear in a moment. I was watching the football last night and all the commentators were assuring me it was going to be a public holiday today. So it's good to see the room is full and I haven't wasted my time coming here. I don't know how many of you have been involved in the Bayes white paper response as well, but today's the deadline for submitting responses to that, so I did that yesterday. So I definitely feel like it's the end of the week. Yes. So I'm primarily a finance professional, but I do have a lot of diverse experience. I was in professional services as well, which has been mentioned a couple of times this morning. I changed jobs in the pandemic to join Johnson Matthey. And I just wanted to ask, has anyone heard of Johnson Matthey? That's good, thank you. So Johnson Matthey is a science company and it specialises in sustainable technologies. It's also in the FTSE 100. What compelled me to join Johnson Matthey was its purpose. It's a purpose of a cleaner, healthier world, and it's something I can really connect to. And I think as you go through the pandemic, we're all questioning our meaning and what we can contribute. So I joined in the pandemic, which wasn't easy, and I'm leading on finance transformation, finance strategy. So doing that remotely is personally quite challenging. All my roles in corporate have been on digital transformation and working in an agile way, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm not going to focus on technology. I'm not going to focus on agile methodologies, but I'm going to focus on leadership and culture, which are the other ingredients for transformation. And my driver for any transformation is to focus on user experience, whether that's an internal user, our customers, and also getting the best use of our talent. So I always talk about experiential transformations, not system transformations. So I've got 3 themes, and then I'm going to share some personal reflections and postulate some thoughts, and let's see where we end up. I think as we've all gone through COVID, it hit us as a lot of focus on the external world and how that impacted us. The virus itself, it's a biological threat. It changed the world of work. Stakeholder needs have shifted, and there's just sheer uncertainty, and that's a lot to deal with. And then I think the attitudes of leaders had to change. They had to be more present, communicate more, and be more flexible and tolerant. You know, we've not been through this before, and we've just had to accept things we wouldn't normally think of. And behaviours became more important. So we have been through something that's clearly unprecedented, and it's a global experience that's also quite unique. And I think it's impossible to go through an experience like that without being changed yourself. So I find it helpful to everyone's talking about crisis. I find it helpful to talk about 2 crises. One is the crisis of the outer world, so the actual, and one is the crisis of the inner world, which is the unconscious, and we all have an unconscious. So as finance leaders, I think we over-attend to the visible and less so to what is not there. But the demands on leaders are often the unconscious demands. And so this is where I begin to think about the inner world. And COVID has brought us face to face with anxiety, losses, fears. Everyone's talking about fear these days. It's not swept under the carpet. Mental well-being. And that really impacts our ability to think clearly. So what's the response to that? It can either be complete denial on one end or hysteria and panic on the other end. And we need something in the middle. We need some healthy level of anxiety to respond appropriately. Just in terms of context, obviously we know at the same time the world is in motion. It does not stand still. And we've got political shocks, volatile commodity pricing, and technology at scale, which is disruptive, and it's blurring the lines between the physical virtual or biological. So these multiple trends, and this isn't a complete list, these multiple trends and forces are creating multi-dimensional uncertainty. And if you think about the people too, what the two skills that we as humans bring are the physical, which is supported or substituted by machines, and the cognitive skills, which are not substituted by machines. I know AI is emerging, but unless you believe in singularity, I don't think we'll get there. So what's not easy to hack are human emotions and human skills, the higher level skills. So love, trust, judgment, critical thinking, creativity, just courage, really. Empathy and managing people. These are skills that are going to have a premium in the digital age. And I think we need now a leadership agenda for this context. For those who still want a rational source, I have pulled this from one of the accounting institutes, but they are also beginning to talk about if digitization's at 4 now and digitization at scale, it's not just about technology. So we go left to right and we end up with the mindsets and behaviours. And I think that's essential to succeed now in the digital world. And I know it's easier said than done, but a good leader wants to know what makes people tick. And leadership is now pivoting to a more human view of leadership. So in my view, the best leader for a digital transformation is actually a more human leader. This, I probably won't have time to go through the details of this, but I quite like this model because you start on the left and go to the right and you think, actually each level I understand, and it's plateaus of mental complexity. And I think we need to get up the plateaus in a more complex world. I am a strong believer in a leader as a learner and meta leadership, and that's not about education and IQ. It's about a growth mindset and renewing yourself and staying relevant. I know leadership's hard, we can all talk about it. You can only learn leadership by doing it and experience it, and you might get better at it. But the key thing that we need to deal with at the moment is holding contradictions and thriving in uncertainty and complexity. Leaders also need to understand how they're feeling as well to work well with teams. At the same time, Linda Grattan from London Business School is telling us we're going to live longer. So she's written a book about 100-year life. And with the rapid change in technology as well, that's questioning how we stay relevant. So I think we must constantly learn and adapt. A second thought for you. Leaders' role now is to ask the right questions and not have the right answers necessarily. And we've all experienced it, I think, moving to more adaptive, agile leadership. The word agile has come from an IT sphere, and to me, it means rapid learning, rapid decision-making cycles, taking decisions with imperfect information, actually taking things forward with only 80% of the answer, and actually taking some risk. So I think we've all experienced getting through COVID. We've got through it by getting through it, really. We've had to learn our way through it. And I think leadership would be an easy and safe undertaking if you knew the answers to all the problems, but you don't, and especially these days. So it's going to be moving from a complicated world where you've got technological answers to a complex world where it's actually a bit more involved. I'll leave this slide with you. This is my only slide on the individual, but I was staggered to learn that in a recent Gallup poll, 85% of the workforce is disengaged. But they come to work wanting to contribute and wanting to make a difference. So something's going wrong there, there's a disconnect. And I think the key is individual empowerment and how people feel, and you as leaders can help with that. So people are seeking intimacy, a sense of belonging, how they contribute, a hunger for meaning. They also obviously want happiness. So that's satisfaction in doing a good job or monetary gratification. And also want to minimize stresses. So what's the remedy to minimize stresses? I think it's collaboration and learning. So you can see where I'm going with this. If I look at some early research on leadership and mental complexity, these are some of the attributes on the list. And I think you think that's quite a good list. But they're all very rational, and they did not include any key emotional attributes of top leadership. This is another model 20 odd years later from Ketch de Vries. And I think the comparison is quite stark because everything on this list is human-centered elements. So I'll just pick a few. Care. I think we need intellectual, spiritual, and mental energies to cope with everything we're coping with at the moment. So we have to take care of ourselves and our teams. Courage. It's not meaning authority and power and shouting. It's actually having courage of our convictions. So again, it goes back to, can we take risk and decisions without perfect information? And then picking up on compassion, I think some of the others are quite evident, but leading with compassion is probably the biggest hurdle. How does a leader contain and hold his or her own anxieties as well as the anxieties of the team? So this is a very different place we're in. And then we come to purpose. The purpose is the why we do what we do. And I think it can often get lost in the how, which is the methods of doing what we do, and the what, which is the outputs and the targets. So we all want to have a purpose when we go to work, and it connects us to something bigger, having an impact in a wider context. And again, that's something humans just naturally want for themselves. So in a sense, I think leadership needs to articulate that link with society. We have a good story at Johnson Matthey, and it's something I can believe in, but how do we get that purpose-led leadership? How do you get the followership? So we're moving from operational and tactical and short-term to more long-term value and thinking about humanity and societies. What does meaning mean? So this again is Ketch de Vries, who I follow quite a lot. Meaning is a basic existential concern for us all, I think. We've all got frontal lobes in our brain, and a consequence of that is we want to feel a sense of belonging, and that's through social connections. We want a sense of competence, doing a good job, a sense of control, and that's just having a voice to choose, really, and go beyond ourselves, that sense of transcendence. So again, connecting to issues larger than ourselves and contributing purposely to society. 3 is a quote from Satya Nadella. Does anyone know Satya Nadella? Not personally, but know of him. He's CEO of Microsoft. Correct? CEO of Microsoft. So I've just chosen that because I think world-renowned CEO. He talked about the C in CEO as being curator of culture. And when he took over, the culture was very rigid. They never talked about suboptimality. They always talked about the smartest guys in the room. But he did a phenomenal job creating a learning culture at Microsoft, and he added, X hundred billions to the market cap of Microsoft. And the key is establishing psychological safety, which is Amy Edmondson's concept. And it's talked about a lot in the media these days, but it takes a specific commitment and certain skills to make it work. And culture, I talk about learning cultures, but I think culture has too long been relegated to the soft stuff or the fluffy stuff. And I believe culture is a powerful differentiator and idiosyncratic strategic asset for a company. It's really hard to imitate a good culture. Now, of course, the other side of that is a culture that causes harm to the company, and I'm sure there's a few examples we can all think of. So strategy and culture go together, and I think culture strategy in its widest sense certainly was for the CEO of Microsoft. Again, this is a slide I'll leave with you. It's just a framework from Wilbur, and just to remind us that there's a comprehensive view of the organisation here. It's not just the observable, and it's the cultural pieces, the less visible. Culture is quite an overused word. We read about culture of anything, really, culture of risk, culture of working capital. And I find that problematic because it puts culture down to a single attribute, was really what we talk about culture as an organisational system. And it's a psychosocial phenomenon. It's really hard to get your head around it, and it involves conscious and unconscious. But that's what we're dealing with, influencing behaviours, influence outcomes, and ultimately the share price. I had a go at measuring culture when I was at Whitbread, and they owned Costa at the time. We're probably all familiar with tools to measure your personal attributes, like Myers-Briggs. It's very polarised, so you can be thinking or feeling. But actually, I think some of the best leaders use their feelings to have better thinking. So I think it's same with culture. There's a lot of models that have been validated. You can work out the attributes of culture, but it's always going to be a mix. It's not so polarised. So I asked a survey across Division A, Division B. So we have Costa, we have Premier Inn, and Group at the top. And what we found is we asked about the culture now and the preferred culture to get successful. And this maps onto this framework, but where we've got congruence or dispersion, they're the areas of interest to us. And it gave us some ideas around cultural destination and interventions, and essentially moving from a compete to more collaborative culture, which was messages around moving decision-making down, being more long-term, more innovative, and more empowering to the teams. At the same time, not losing all the good things in the compete culture. Whistle stop tour of culture. So personal reflections. This is all pretty fresh, actually. I'm just about to publish a thought piece on the triple present. And I put that in the title today, but the task of reflecting on the past, the present, and the future, I think is a unique circumstance for the CFO and the finance function. And that's, the CFO is unique executive role that's concerned with that triple present. So if I think about the past, the CFO role has been perpetually loaded over decades. It's got broader, but it's also got more integrative. So other functions are now reporting into the CFO. I talk about CFO as chiefly financial officer now because it's a misnomer to say it's chief financial officer. At the same time, we've got this incessant raising of the bar of the regulations. CFOs are also telling us themselves, you look at the surveys, that they're juggling too many responsibilities. So despite this increased collaboration, there's a dislocation here and a psychological disconnect with what they're actually experiencing. So they're telling us they're doing too much. If I think about the present, obviously finance is about being rational and intellectual, but it's not necessarily all it's about. And there's an essential role of a leader to connect as well. And connection's about sharing vulnerability. And so I'm talking more about moving from the role of a leader to leadership capabilities. And then finally, the future, again, a big weight above us. The connected CFO has to become more connective. And I think that's a need for the CFO to be more tuned into the external, particularly the political and social realms. So I think the next decade is going to be particularly disruptive because we're going to have, obviously, technology coming in, but more scrutiny, more accountability, perhaps increased shareholder activism. We're seeing that quite a lot at massive companies, including GSK. There's going to be more social responsibility, more ESG, and pressures on the person themselves. There's changing organizational structures, transformations, the need to manage these multiple boundaries and manage their own psychology. So there's a lot of pressure on the individual. And if I think about what we're doing at Johnson Matthey, we've got a clear interlink with ESG. It's very important to our investors, very important to us. We are looking at sustainable technologies, pivoting now away from the internal combustion engine to electrification, so looking at battery materials, circularity, decarbonisation, hydrogen fuel cells. So we're very much part of that story. We're not just about reducing harms and emissions, we're actually a key part of supply chains of other companies. When I think about reimagining of finance then, I'm talking in my teams and the organisation about finance for the future, not finance of the future. So finance for the future supports this, it's more integrative. Finance of the future sounds quite an existential concern of, will I still be here? How do I stay relevant? So I think there's a subtle difference there. So finally, just three high-level things about high-level leadership. So I'm going to group them as relevance, resilience, and relatedness. And firstly, relevance. So I think leaders need to be perspective-seeking, capitalise on difference. So this is the diversity agenda, but that's not just the observable differences. It's cognitive, experiential differences. Learn from others and learn from difference. As I said before, leader is a learner. You can't stand still. And exceptional leaders are infinite learners. And it's not just reading a book, it's experiential learning. Adaptation, a growth mindset begets resilience. And learning involves some form of disruption. So if you're not getting disruption, disrupt yourselves. Finally, relatedness then. We come back to connected leadership. I think an essential role of a leader is to connect. That's connecting people and connecting issues. So there's a contextual intelligence there, joining the dots, but also a connection with yourself. So self-care, self-renewal, understanding yourself, which is a lifelong endeavour, but yourself as a tool is very important. Connecting with people, so obviously being collaborative, but offering high challenge, high support for high-performing teams. Connecting with emotions, so being empathetic, which is talked about more these days. And understanding your own feelings and those of your team. So a simple question, how are you? That does strike a long conversation. And connection with business as well and the organisation. But beyond that, beyond the economics of the business, wider society and meaning. So I've just put all three there as capabilities we should hold on to. One I haven't put on there is a negative capability, and that's being comfortable with not knowing. I think that's also key for leading, and that's the capacity to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty and resist dispersing into inappropriate actions. Being fully present in what you're actually doing and getting on with, and not what is meant to happen. And that's a negative capability. I'm not going to go into this, but it's another idea I've had about an experience of working at home and parenting the good enough leader based on Winnicott's ideas. I'm happy to talk about another time, but appreciate we're probably chairman. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I'm conscious of the time.
Yeah, no, thanks, Malcolm. We can run to one, so you don't.
That's fine. I'm happy to make it interactive. So yeah.
Thanks, Malcolm. So one of the things I've always thought about is, I'm over here, is culture starts at the top. And if you work for an owner-managed business, which is kind of 1 in 10 that didn't go bust, so it's obviously been doing something well and it's grown into something successful, but that owner-manager is still there. And they are likely driving the culture through the organisation based on how they've done things for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And so we come into a business and I see the theory, I like the ideas, but just interested, what would your advice be to influence a culture upwards? Because a lot of what you're saying is how you kind of cascade it.
No, that's true. And I'm saying a big part and a big element of culture is leadership, but culture is actually owned by everyone, all the organisational members, and they all contribute to culture. And it's how people feel. So surely there's going to be some feedback, some feeling in the organisation that's going to go back to that owner-manager. And you'll see it in performance as well. You know, I think I've not shown it here, but when it gets really interesting is when you can measure culture and correlate that to performance. And you know, the key thing for us in the interventions we played back said, look, this is what you are telling us, and you probably need that leader to say, I can be responsive to this. I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm giving some thoughts here for discussion, and I'm not a culture consultant in a way, but if anyone else has got any thoughts on that, there's probably more qualified people in the room who can help with that question. I don't know. Okay.
Any other questions? Sorry, did we finish that point? Did you want to move on to another?
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Malcolm, thank you for the...
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to locate you. Yes, okay.
Thank you for your presentation, and big fan of Johnson Matthey as well as a company.
Okay.
I just have a small question. It is a rocky road to leadership, and for those who are in the path, what is your advice to help them to build that personal resilience, because it's really not always easy?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know if you can talk to your own experience, whether you think you've become more resilient over the last 12 months, 16 months, or anyone else can. But I think, you know, we've all had personal challenges. We've all had to face losses and anxieties. And I think, you know, you can only get resilience through experience. And it's adversity, it's actually coming back to the learning, it's actually disrupting yourself. So if you're staying comfortable, great, it's a cozy slipper, you can stay there for years. But if you're ambitious, you want to change, you want to get up to leadership, you need to push yourself, challenge yourself, disrupt yourself. And as I said, you know, leadership isn't something you're going to pick up a book and say, okay, I've read this chapter, tick it off, I'm now a leader. It is actually doing it. So it's actually you know, the experiential piece as well. There's many times I was at Vodafone, head of reporting at Vodafone, coming up to the close under lockdown, and I said to the team, you know, showing vulnerability, I don't know how we're going to do this. Obviously, we want to close the books, we want to produce an annual report, we want to get it audited, we want to be accurate. We're also under SOX. How do we evidence all these controls? You know, usually we have piles of paper that big with me signing them off. So we thought, oh gosh, and then I said, well, actually, what we thought about before is digital last mile reporting. Let's accelerate that. Put everything into this work, and if it doesn't work, then we can't deliver. And I didn't know at the time, we just did it. We self-formed a team across IT, our design consultants, external consultants, finance, investor relations, tax, and came together and said, what do we need and how are we going to do this? And I got a software company in as well. And we ended up with a really good product where we could go from HFM, which is our consolidation package, to the PDF design, perfect output, styles, typeface, colours, everything of the annual report with no human intervention. And that took, a year to get where we had a concept, and then the last 2 or 3 months we really pushed it, and we're able to close remotely, get audited, and just press a button and, you know, have this annual report. And that's left my team in a very good place, you know, very resilient. I don't know what else I could have done in that role at Vodafone, and you know, we had this automated reporting. I oversaw 3 big accounting standards in 2 years, did a lot of the strategic change, the Tower Co, IPO. I disrupted myself. You know, I had to say, well, I could keep doing this or I could do something else. So maybe that answers or doesn't answer your question, but I think just sharing a personal experience of disruption, maybe that might help. Anyone else, or should we go for lunch? That's not to say don't ask questions.
It's really interesting listening to you talk about disrupt yourself and the sort of psychological demands, I think, of being a leader these days. But one of the challenges, I think, in balancing all that, sort of those psychological demands is, to your point, the anxiety, and that swimming to the point of tension constantly is quite draining. And yet, and we have all this focus on well-being and mental health, and it's interesting listening to Neil talk in his last presentation about hiring a well-being person. And yet I still think it would be frowned upon if someone phoned up and said, I'm having a mental health day, I need a duvet day. And I'd be really interested to get your thoughts of how we overcome that and how we can support that in a way that makes that okay.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge, I think, isn't it? Reducing the stigma of it. And I think that's how that comes back to how we all talk about it. So, you know, what is our tolerance? You know, what is how, you know, we should be accepting of this. You know, we're all people. And you know, I talk to my teams about it. They are, again, if I go back to the question, how are you? I would have some of my team saying, actually, I'm really stressed. I'm panicking, blah, blah, blah. You know, and you then have that counselling moment, and you don't shun it away. You don't sweep it under the carpet. You say, look, that is perfectly understandable. How can I support? I felt the same. Going back to vulnerability, and I think we've all had moments of that. And you asked the question about burnout as well? Yes, yeah. So I think that's a big risk. You think we're all working at home, all sitting in a familiar place, but we're all actually quite isolated. And it's really hard to create the boundaries. You don't have the commute in, you don't have the commute back. And just having no structure in a way is really damaging and counterproductive. I've seen a lot of my team, and I'm guilty of it myself, you just become exhausted with the back-to-back meetings, lose motivation, lose your drive, lose energy, and that's a sort of massive risk, and that is mental health. You know, that's how you are performing, and there's a reason for it. So I tell my teams, just create boundaries. You know, don't turn your computer off. I'm guilty. I always dip into it after dinner. To create those boundaries, don't have back-to-back meetings. Create psychological space. You need that psychological retreat for your own sanity. You can't operate like that. I don't know where we're heading in terms of hybrid work. I think it obviously will be some hybrid model. And it's just a question of balance then, isn't it? How many days here, how many days there? But again, it comes back to connection. We're humans, we need that social connection. If we've been deprived of it for so long, we need some balance of it. And, you know, just even pouring out of a beer in a bar, or for those that don't drink orange juice in a bar, is massively therapeutic, isn't it? So, again, I'm not an expert. I just deal with things in a human way, but I think there's a lot we need to think about with even just the hybrid working. There's a lot of challenges around that. Yeah.
So I'm lucky enough to work for an organisation that recognises the mental health challenges of being at home all the time. So we've had our office open for as long as we can to allow people that flexibility if they need to come into the office, not just because it's, you know, they don't have the technology or whatever, just because actually mentally that works better for them. But one of the biggest challenges I find in the hybrid working model is that if there is a room of people having a meeting and you're on the screen, you don't feel part of that meeting.
Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts on how we can overcome that?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I've experienced that as well. And another experience of that is where you're connected to a big room with people sitting around the table and you can't even see who's speaking. So you just see this blur of a table, little dots as faces, and it's really hard to connect to a meeting like that. I'm probably losing track on your question here, but have I got any recommendations of, I guess it's essentially how we stay connected remotely, isn't it? I think it's, again, humanizing a meeting. So if you start a meeting, this is something I do, 5 minutes is just talking about something other than the meeting. And that creates a space that allows people to content shift, because they've just probably come back from another meeting. They need time to decompress and content shift before they can engage again with another meeting. So I think, and in itself, that is a connection and is helpful. And I'm happy for anyone else to comment, because I'm not an expert. Yes, sorry, I'm not chairman either. Okay.
Yeah, I had a global workforce of 950 people, and similar sort of challenges, because we're running transformation programs, and some of them could come to London and some of them couldn't. Probably got easier with COVID because almost everyone was there, and you could actually, to one of the earlier questions, there's some automated features that allow you to do random breakouts, which just put everyone into a room for a set period of time, which are phenomenal. But to the question around being in the room, there's some good old-fashioned things around bearing in mind there's someone there and almost reading stuff out, telling people how people are feeling. It's the old, I'm quite candid in my approach, but I was saying, George over there really does, the look on his face, he really doesn't like what you've just said. And giving space for the person to comment and making sure that the materials are being presented, someone's scribbling, get the iPhone out, show it. So we've actually almost fallen back on traditional methods, but using the technologies. We ended up running a virtual, one of those off going and doing a puzzle thing, an adventure game. We ran one of those in COVID virtually with someone with a helmet on and doing it. And it allowed us to connect globally, but still do some traditional fun things that were always getting lost. And so but I would say as a leader, there was a lot of effort. I think you were saying about getting burnout yourself on doing things that are a lot of effort to do, like the step meetings, like I had people in America that are quite candid, but were getting burnout. But I found as a leader to check in with them using the chat function. How are you feeling? You said you weren't going to come. Absolutely fine. Are you all right? But also use examples myself. I've got young kids, so I'd always be telling them, I'm taking Henry in this morning, or I'm going to be late for this, and just. That was my way. I think the challenge I had, it was not all my superiors, not the board, didn't have those values as well. So my engagement scores were really high for the company, and theirs wasn't. But sometimes it was frowned upon. So I'm interested if anyone's got any comments on that, because I think there's a bit of a revolution coming, that this is a better way of leading. But
No, that's great, and thanks for your contribution. I mean, this is the whole point we're meeting here is a learning opportunity in itself, isn't it? So. I just picked up on one point you made about asking how someone's feeling and they say fine. That probably means they're not fine. And it's just a dismissive, yeah, fine, what's next? Paolo Gallo, who I follow as well quite closely, has got an emotion wheel, and there's probably 100 different emotions categorized out from happy into 10 other dimensions. And I think fine is probably not an adequate answer. And you think, well, actually, are you? Maybe there's another level to explore. And I agree with the point you make. It's really hard to sense body language, and you're just seeing a face. And it's very artificial as well, isn't it? You just stare at someone and you don't feel comfortable in yourself, even looking at your own image. Well, I speak for myself. But, it's not natural, and it's just weird in all ways. But I think we are getting used to it. Yes. Sorry. How are we doing? We're good. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I think one thing I wanted to know from you, as your perspective as well, is leadership has various definitions. Then if you type on Amazon leadership, you'll have hundreds of books coming in and all. Yeah. What do you think is the most important trait of a leader? My view is that it is creating more leaders around himself. If he's able to do that, I think, to me, I'm sitting here, but I know that I'm coaching somebody to actually fill my shoes in when I'm not there. And that's exactly what I think is the most important thing. In my view, what according to you is the most important thing?
Yeah, so I've done an MBA years ago, and I'm obviously familiar with all the frameworks on leadership, and I don't often buy into all of them. I think a key question you ask is there a person I can trust just to put in a position? How will they cope with the unknown? You know, because competence is one thing, but it's actually leading in the unknown is something else, and finding a way through, bring a team with you. So I think it's about my theme about connected leadership. It's about personal connection, and it's about agility, and just being always open to learning and discovering things about yourself as well. The better we understand ourselves, the better leaders will be. So I spend a lot of time trying to understand myself and how I respond in certain situations. And if you can understand how you respond, you can transfer that in the way you lead as well. So coaching is very good. And when I talk about coaching, it's not time management, you know, people management. It's more the psychodynamic, systemic thinking, which I'm into. Okay.
Malcolm, that was brilliant. So, any final question before we break? But for me, that was a really thought-provoking session, and I think it really certainly helped me think about, you know, what's the sort of culture that you want to build in your team? What sort of a team do you want to be? What sort of a leader do you want to be? And all the things to think about. So
yeah, there's a lot to think about. Yeah. But don't overthink.
No, so thanks, Malcolm. That was really great insight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.